Emily stepped off the subway and hurried along the Brooklyn sidewalk. It was early morning, still cold, the streets damp from the night before. She glanced at her phone. She had less than 10 minutes to reach the office. She walked fast, adjusting the strap of her purse on her shoulder and keeping her eyes ahead. Her heels tapped against the pavement. She needed to focus on her report, the one she had barely started. If she did not finish it soon, her boss would hand the promotion to someone else. Halfway down the block, a loose metal grate caught the heel of her shoe. Her ankle twisted, and she stumbled forward. She managed to catch herself before hitting the ground, her heart pounding. She stood upright again, smoothed her coat, and looked around. There, a few feet away, was the man she saw every morning. He always sat on the same spot, near the old ventilation cover, wearing layers of torn clothes and a thick beard. He never asked for money or spoke to anyone. He just sat there looking into the distance. This time he was looking right at her. His eyes were fixed on her face. Emily cleared her throat. She needed to get going. She took one step forward, but the man raised his hand, holding out a crumpled piece of paper. She paused. "Do you need something?" she asked, unsure if he would answer. He nodded slowly, extending the note again. She hesitated, then reached out and took it. She studied his face. There was a strange intensity in his eyes, as if he had been waiting a long time for this moment. Emily wanted to ask him what it meant, but she was already late. Her phone buzzed in her purse, probably a reminder that she was behind schedule. "Look, I have to go," she said. "Thank you." She turned away and continued down the street, walking faster now, feeling her heart beat faster than before. Inside that piece of paper, there might be a message she did not expect. She did not open it yet. She needed a place where no one would bump into her, and where she could think for a second. On the next corner, she spotted a small cafe. She entered and joined the short line, tapping her foot. When it was her turn, she ordered a large black coffee. The place smelled like pastries and fresh bread. After grabbing her cup, she sat by the window, pulled out the folded piece of paper, and flattened it on the small table. Her eyes scanned the scribbled words. As she read them, she tightened her grip on the note. The words did not make any sense at first. It said he was her father. It mentioned a hidden inheritance. It gave her a name, Mr. Marshall. Something about contacting him. Something about legal documents. She swallowed hard. She tried to remember what she knew about her father. Very little, actually. Her mother had never given her a clear story. Emily's hands trembled as she folded the note and placed it into her purse. Could this be real? That man outside, that homeless man, was he really her father? If so, why show up now? Why reveal this secret with a simple note on the street? Her phone showed the time. She was going to be late if she did not leave now. Emily stood up, tossed the empty coffee cup, and pushed the door open. She rushed back out into the street. Her mind raced. She could not afford to lose her job. She had worked too hard to reach this point. But that note might be a chance to solve her financial problems. A secret inheritance? It sounded ridiculous, but at the same time it might explain many unanswered questions. She walked the final blocks to the office building. Inside the lobby, she nodded at the security guard and took the elevator up. She tried to steady her breathing. On her floor, a few co-workers looked up. Marcus, a friend from the accounting department, approached her desk just as she settled in. "You're late," Marcus said quietly, leaning on the divider between their workstations. "You okay? You look rattled." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but what could she say? "I'm fine," she said. "Rough morning. Twisted my ankle, that's all." Marcus studied her face but let it go. "We have that team meeting at 10, he said. "Don't forget." She nodded, then turned on her computer. She tried to concentrate, but her mind returned to the note. Could she trust it? Should she even consider meeting this Mr. Marshall? She moved the mouse, opened her documents, and pulled up her half-finished report. She typed a few lines. Nothing made sense. Her chest felt tight. A few minutes later, as she opened her desk drawer to find a pen, she saw a large envelope resting on top of her keyboard. It had no sender's name, just her first name scrawled in blue ink. She glanced around. Nobody seemed to notice. She slid the envelope into her lap and opened it under the desk. Inside, there was a photograph. It showed her father, if that homeless man was truly her father, standing next to a well-dressed man. The photo looked old. Behind it, a warning was scribbled. "Stay out of things you don't understand." Her pulse quickened. Someone was watching. Someone knew that she had spoken to that man. She swallowed hard and shoved the envelope into her purse. Marcus glanced over. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," Emily said, breathing through her nose and forcing her shoulders to relax. She pulled up her report again and tried to focus. Lines of text filled the screen, but she could not concentrate. She tapped her foot under the desk. She remembered the old man's eyes and the tension in the air that morning. Her boss, Mrs. Donovan, walked by and frowned. "Emily, I need that report by tomorrow," she said. "No excuses." Emily nodded quickly. "I know," she said. "I'll have it done." Mrs. Donovan walked away. Emily's thoughts drifted again. If that man really was her father, what kind of mess was he involved in? She rubbed her forehead. She had no time for this. She had bills to pay and a career to build, yet something pushed her to dig deeper. The picture and the warning worried her. Who had placed that envelope on her desk? Outside the window, traffic moved slowly. She shifted in her chair. She knew she should ignore this mystery, but her curiosity was too strong. The note said to find Mr. Marshall. Maybe he had answers. Maybe he could explain why her father lived on the streets. Maybe this could solve her financial troubles. Right now, all she had was confusion. She looked at her computer screen again, whispered under her breath, "I must find out the truth," and started to type, mind racing with questions. Emily did not leave the office until lunch break. She spent the morning struggling to focus on her report. Her eyes moved over the words, but her mind kept drifting to the note and the photograph. The man on the street, Thomas, had to be there again. He was always there. She needed to confront him now, before fear stopped her from trying. As soon as the clock struck noon, she logged off and rushed outside, barely acknowledging Marcus's curious glance. The sun was higher now, the cold a bit less biting. She moved quickly along the sidewalk, scanning faces and corners. Soon she spotted Thomas sitting in the same spot, leaning against the old grate. She drew closer, her heart racing. He looked up at her. There was a new tension in his eyes, as if he knew she had read the note. He did not speak. Emily stopped a few steps away and lowered her voice. "Why did you give me that note?" she asked. "What do you mean you're my father?" Thomas looked around, then back at her. His voice was low and shaky. "Emily," he said, "I know it's hard to believe, but I need you to trust me. There's a man named Marshall." "Hold on," she said, feeling her muscles tighten. "You can't just show up out of nowhere and claim something like that." She looked around again. The street seemed normal, people passing by, but something felt off. She noticed two men standing near a parked van. They seemed to be watching them. She lowered her voice further. "Why are people following you?" Thomas narrowed his eyes and struggled to stand. His knees shook. "I can't explain everything right now," he said. "They know about the inheritance. They know who I am. They don't want you to find Marshall." Emily's head spun. She felt sweat on her palms. Before she could ask another question, the two men stepped forward. One was tall with a leather jacket, the other wore a gray hoodie. The tall one pushed Thomas against the wall. "What the hell are you doing?" Emily shouted. She stepped forward, ignoring the pulse pounding in her ears. The one in the hoodie spoke with a rough voice. "Hand over whatever he gave you." Emily felt a surge of anger and fear. She shoved the man's arm away from Thomas. "Leave him alone," she said. Her voice was shaky, but she did not back off. She looked around for something to use. There was a loose piece of pipe near a trash bin. She grabbed it, holding it in front of her like a bat. The tall man smirked. "Big mistake." Emily's heart hammered, but she held her ground. Thomas trembled behind her. She swung the pipe in a wide arc, not hitting anyone, but keeping them back. A few passers-by slowed down, unsure whether to intervene. The two men hesitated, probably not expecting resistance. After a tense moment, they stepped back, muttering curses under their breath. They turned and walked quickly away, disappearing around the corner. Emily dropped the pipe to the ground. Her knees felt weak. She turned to Thomas. His lip was split, and he held his arm as if it hurt. She reached out to him, her voice tense. "You need help." Thomas nodded slowly. "There's a shelter 2 blocks down. I have a room there," he said. "Please help me get there." She put an arm around him and guided him down the sidewalk. He walked with difficulty, his breathing heavy. At the shelter, a volunteer recognized Thomas and helped him into a small room with a narrow bed and a faded curtain. Emily followed them inside. Thomas sat on the bed and looked up at her. "I never wanted this," he said quietly. "I stayed away because I thought it was safer for you. But now you need to find Marshall. He has documents that prove everything. I left something for you too." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, rusty key. He pressed it into her hand. "This opens a storage locker in Red Hook. You'll find answers there." Emily stared at the key. "This is insane," she whispered. "I have no idea what's going on. Why would you hide this? Why not just tell me?" Thomas's voice weakened. "They ruined me. I lost everything. The inheritance is real, but it's tied to documents hidden away. That's why you must find Marshall. He can guide you. Trust no one else." Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket. She needed to go back to work. She looked at Thomas's tired face, felt the weight of the key in her hand, and nodded. "I'll try," she said. "But I need time." Thomas grabbed her wrist gently. "Be careful," he said. "They're watching. They already tried to scare you." Emily swallowed and left the room. Outside, she breathed in the stale hallway air. She had to return to the office before Mrs. Donovan noticed her absence. As she hurried down the street, her mind raced. Was this a scam? Why would these men attack Thomas if it was all fake? The note, the photograph, the threats, all too real. She reached the office, trying not to look suspicious. At her desk, she found another envelope waiting. It bore no name. Her heartbeat accelerated as she opened it. Inside was a photograph of Thomas, dressed in a sharp suit, standing beside a distinguished-looking man. On the back, a warning. "Don't get involved." Emily stuffed it into her drawer. Her hands were shaking. Marcus peeked over the divider. "Hey, are you sure you're okay?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She nodded curtly. "I'm just under pressure. The report, you know." She focused on her computer screen, trying to appear normal. In reality, her mind was caught in a storm. She had a key in her pocket, a father who lived on the streets, and a name. Marshall. She needed to figure out who he was. As the afternoon dragged on, she could barely type a coherent sentence. She thought about the storage locker in Red Hook. She knew the neighborhood from news stories, old warehouses, and storage units down by the waterfront. She also thought about the men who attacked Thomas. Would they come after her next? At one point, Mrs. Donovan passed by and reminded Emily about the deadline. Emily forced a tight smile. "Working on it," she said. Inside, she felt trapped. She had until tomorrow to finish, yet her life had just been turned upside down. She had to make a plan. But first, she needed to survive the workday. Minutes before leaving the office, Emily stared at her monitor and whispered to herself, "I have no choice. I have to find Marshall." She shut down her computer, grabbed her coat, and headed for the door, uncertain and afraid, but determined to uncover the truth. Emily left the office building and headed straight to her apartment. She entered, locked the door, and stood by the small kitchen table thinking. She told herself she would try to sleep, but she barely managed a few restless hours. When her alarm buzzed the next morning, her eyes were heavy and her neck stiff. She dressed quickly, drank black coffee, and left early, determined to follow the clue about Mr. Marshall. She wanted to find out who he was before going to work. She needed something solid. If she missed this chance, she might never understand what was happening. As soon as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the air felt heavy. Her thoughts drifted back to the key Thomas gave her and the storage locker in Red Hook. But first, Marshall. The note had told her to find him. If he was a lawyer, he might have an office somewhere in the city. She searched his name on her phone's browser while walking, and after scrolling through a few results, she found a small law practice address in Midtown. She hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address. In the taxi, she gripped her phone, checking the clock. If she wasted too much time, Mrs. Donovan would question her again, and she could not afford that right now. The taxi pulled up in front of a tall building with tinted windows. Emily paid the fare and stepped out. The directory in the lobby listed M. Marshall, attorney at law, on the 4th floor. She took the elevator up, feeling a tight knot in her stomach. On the 4th floor, she turned a corner and stopped. The door to Marshall's office was open, the frame splintered as if someone had forced it. Inside, furniture was overturned, and papers littered the floor. A faint smell of burnt paper hung in the air. Emily stepped inside carefully, her heart pounding. The place was a mess. Desk drawers were pulled out, chairs knocked over. It looked like someone had searched for something in a hurry. She bent down and picked up a scorched folder. It was empty. Someone had tried to destroy evidence. There were a few charred scraps of paper near the window. She looked around, calling softly, "Mr. Marshall?" No answer. She tried a small door at the back, maybe a storage room, but it was locked. She pressed her ear against it and heard nothing. When she stepped back into the main office, a uniformed police officer appeared in the doorway. "Miss, you can't be in here," he said, taking a step forward. "I'm sorry," Emily said, raising her hands. "I didn't know. I'm looking for Mr. Marshall." The officer frowned. "He's missing. We got a call this morning. Looks like a break-in. Nobody knows where he is." Emily's chest tightened. If Marshall was missing, then she had lost a key ally before even meeting him. She backed away slowly. "I understand," she said, swallowing. "I'll leave." Back in the hallway, she tried to calm down. She looked at the time. She would be late if she did not hurry to the office. She rushed downstairs, stepped onto the street, and jogged toward the subway station. On the train, she tapped her foot anxiously. Without Marshall, how could she find out the truth? Maybe the storage locker was her next best lead, but that would have to wait until after work. When she arrived at the office, Mrs. Donovan glared at her. Emily apologized, rushed to her desk, and tried to focus on the report. She typed a few paragraphs, forcing herself to ignore the mounting tension. Around mid-morning, Marcus approached again. "Emily," he said, leaning in. "Is something going on? You look like you're in a different world." She hesitated, but she needed at least one person on her side. "I'm dealing with some family issues," she said quietly. "Someone's missing and I need help." Marcus raised his eyebrows. "Missing? That sounds serious. Do you need me to check something? Maybe help somehow?" Emily studied his face. He seemed sincere, but after what happened, she felt paranoid. Still, Marcus was her friend, and she had no one else. "I might need help verifying some documents soon," she said. "If I give you some papers, can you look at them, see if they're authentic?" Marcus nodded. Of course, just let me know when. Emily nodded and turned back to her computer. She needed to secure her job first. She spent the rest of the morning typing, summarizing, and formatting the report. She had to finish it by the afternoon, or risk losing the promotion. Every few minutes, her mind wandered to the destroyed office of Mr. Marshall. Someone had wanted him out of the picture. At noon, she considered going back to the street to see if Thomas was still at the shelter, but decided against it. She should wait until after work. She had no guarantee that the men who attacked them would not be waiting. Instead, she ate a quick sandwich at her desk and kept working. Her hands shook slightly when she thought about the storage locker. She would go there today, after work, no matter what. Early afternoon, Mrs. Donovan stopped by again. "Emily, that report," she said, tapping the desk with her fingernail. "It better be ready today." Emily nodded. "I'm almost done," she said. Her voice sounded steady, at least on the surface. By mid-afternoon, Emily finished the last page. She printed the report, placed it in a folder, and dropped it on Mrs. Donovan's desk. "All done," she said, trying not to show how relieved she felt. Mrs. Donovan gave a curt nod. "Good. We'll discuss your promotion tomorrow." Emily managed a small smile. With the report finished, she felt a bit lighter. She glanced at Marcus's desk. He was on a call. She decided not to bother him now. Instead, she gathered her things and left a few minutes early, claiming she had a personal emergency. Outside, the sky had darkened slightly, and the wind picked up. She hailed a taxi again and gave the driver the address for a storage facility in Red Hook. The ride took longer than expected due to traffic. She watched the streets change as they moved away from Midtown. Warehouse after warehouse, old docks, and deserted lots passed by the window. At the storage facility, she paid the fare and stepped out. It was quiet, except for a distant rumble of a truck engine. She walked along a row of storage units until she found the one with a matching number to the note she remembered from the papers. She held the rusty key Thomas gave her and inserted it into the padlock. It turned with some difficulty. Inside, it smelled like dust and old metal. A single overhead light flickered when she found the switch. She scanned the small space. There were old boxes, a metal cabinet, and a few crates stacked in the corner. She tried the cabinet door. It was locked, but the key fit there too. She opened it, and inside she found a thick folder of documents. She pulled it out and blew off the dust. As she flipped through the papers, she recognized her father's name, old bank statements, photographs, and a list of names. On one of the papers, she saw the name Jenny Cross and an address scrawled in pen. She felt her heart beat faster. This might be her next lead. Before she could read more, she heard a noise behind her. Something fell outside. She stood still, listening. Was someone out there? She stuffed the documents into her bag and turned off the light, stepping out quietly. She glanced around, seeing no one. Still, she felt uneasy. She needed to leave now. She locked the unit and headed toward the exit. The whole time she felt as if someone might be watching. She gripped her bag tight, determined not to lose these documents. She had to find Jenny Cross and learn the truth behind this twisted situation. Emily stepped out onto the street, holding her bag tight. The documents inside felt important. She needed to reach the address linked to Jenny Cross, written on that note. The sky was dull gray, and the air smelled of damp metal. She walked quickly, checking behind her now and then. No one seemed to be following, but she could not shake the feeling that she had been watched. She reached the main road and waved down a passing taxi. She gave the driver the address she found on the papers. He nodded and pulled into traffic. Emily settled into the back seat, mind racing. Without Marshall and with Thomas in danger, Jenny Cross might be her best shot at getting solid answers. The taxi ride stretched on through slow intersections and crowded streets. She kept looking out the window, tense, fingers tapping her knee. They arrived at a 3-story apartment building on a quiet block. The exterior looked worn. with chipped paint on the front door and a few loose bricks near a mailbox. Emily paid the driver and stepped out, looking around. It was late afternoon, not many people on the sidewalks. She approached the door and tried it. Locked. She pressed a button on the buzzer panel. No response. She tried again. Nothing. A neighbor emerged from the building next door carrying groceries. Emily cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said. "Do you know Jenny Cross? I'm trying to reach her." The neighbor, a middle-aged woman in a heavy coat, paused. "Jenny Cross? She lives on the second floor, left apartment. She's usually home. Try knocking on her window in the back alley. Sometimes her buzzer's broken." Emily thanked her and circled around to the alley. There, a narrow walkway led behind the building. A set of fire escapes clung to the walls. She spotted a window with pale curtains, slightly open. She climbed a few steps of the fire escape and knocked lightly on the glass. No answer. She knocked again, then pushed the window gently. It slid open. Inside, the room was neat and small. No one stood inside. She hesitated, but she had no other lead. She needed information, and if Jenny was not home, maybe she could leave a note. Emily hoisted herself through the window, landing softly on a worn rug. The place smelled like coffee and books. She walked slowly, calling out in a low voice. "Jenny? Hello?" The apartment was quiet. In the living room, a cup half full of coffee sat on a small table. A coat hung on a chair. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. Emily checked the bedroom door, which stood slightly open. The bed was made, clothes folded on a chair. On a desk near the window, a stack of letters and files caught her eye. She moved closer and saw familiar names, the same corporate names that appeared in her father's documents. She found a letter mentioning former business partners in shady deals. Emily sat down and flipped through the papers. Jenny Cross had been someone who worked closely with her father, maybe as a personal assistant or secretary. The letters mentioned a betrayal that led to Thomas losing his fortune. They also hinted that the inheritance Emily sought was tied up in a legal battle. She recognized some of the names from the destroyed office of Mr. Marshall and from the old newspapers in the storage unit. Suddenly, a faint noise from outside made her freeze. She got up and approached the window. In the alley below, a man wearing a dark cap was looking up, his eyes scanning the windows. She ducked down, heart pounding. It looked like the same kind of man who attacked Thomas. They had found her again. She bit her lip and backed away from the window. If Jenny was not here, Emily could not waste time. She stuffed a few letters and a photograph into her bag. The photograph showed Thomas, younger and well-dressed, with several men in suits. On the back, a handwritten note, proof of their involvement. She placed it in her bag, then turned to leave. As she stepped into the living room, she heard footsteps on the fire escape. She rushed to the window she came in from and peered out carefully. The alley was empty now, but she doubted it would remain so. She decided to leave through the main door, hoping no one would notice. She opened the apartment door quietly and stepped into a dim hallway. She hurried down the stairs, trying to be silent. On the first floor, she heard someone enter the building. She pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath. The footsteps passed by the door, heading upstairs. Emily took a chance and slipped outside. She stepped onto the sidewalk, keeping her head down. She turned the corner, moving quickly, trying to put distance between herself and whoever was inside the building. After a few blocks, she slowed down. Her pulse was racing. She checked her phone. She had missed a call from the shelter. She remembered Thomas's condition and how she had neglected to go back and check on him. She dialed the shelter's number. A volunteer answered and said Thomas had grown weaker. He had been taken to a hospital ward run by the shelter to receive better care. Emily thanked them and hung up, feeling guilt gnaw at her. Before she could plan her next move, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. She hesitated, then answered. A rough voice spoke. "You're making a mistake. the voice said. "Stop digging. Don't test us again." "Who is this?" Emily asked, her voice shaky. "Doesn't matter," the person replied. "Stay away from what you don't understand." The line went dead. Emily lowered the phone, clenching it tight. She stood on the sidewalk, near a closed bakery with metal shutters. It was getting dark, and the streetlights were flickering on. She realized how alone she was. She had no father by her side, no lawyer to guide her, and Jenny Cross had vanished. The documents she held were her only lead now. She had the photo, the letters from Jenny's apartment, and the old files from the storage unit. Marcus might help analyze them. But could she trust him fully? She considered going back to her apartment, locking the door, and trying to sort it all out. Yet she knew time was running short, and her father was in a dire state. Emily walked towards a bus stop, gripping her bag. She would return home, review every piece of paper, and then decide her next step. She looked up and saw the sky turning darker by the minute. She only knew one thing now. These people would not stop. She had to press on, find a way to secure the inheritance, free her father from this nightmare, and protect herself before it all slipped away. That night, Emily barely slept. She sat on the floor of her small apartment, her back against the couch, reading and rereading the documents she had gathered. She organized them into piles, financial records, letters, and photographs. Some documents mentioned secret accounts tied to her father's name. Others noted deadlines and conditions for releasing certain funds. One letter warned that unless the correct documents were presented before a strict date, the inheritance would remain locked. The date was coming soon, possibly by the end of the week. By morning, her eyes were red and her head ached. She glanced at the clock. She had to leave for work. Before heading out, she put all the documents into a plain folder and slipped it into her bag. She felt heavy and tense. If she failed to secure the inheritance and clear her father's name, who knew what would happen? She had no choice now but to trust someone. Marcus was the only person who showed willingness to help. Maybe he could confirm these documents were authentic and help her figure out her next move. At the office, she entered quietly, keeping her head down, heading straight to her desk. Mrs. Donovan approached. "Emily," she said, arms crossed, "the directors will review your report today. Don't forget we have a staff meeting at 11. Emily nodded, her voice flat. Understood. She wanted to ask about her promotion but knew it was not the time. A few minutes later, Marcus rolled his chair closer. He spoke in a low tone. "You look worse today. Are you sure everything's okay?" Emily looked around, making sure no one listened. "I need your help," she said quietly. "It's serious. I have documents I need verified. Old financial statements, suspicious names. Can you check them out and tell me if they look genuine?" Marcus blinked, confused. "What is this about?" he asked. Emily tensed. "It's about family matters. There's a possible inheritance and there are people trying to stop me from claiming it." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Sounds complicated. Sure, I can take a look. Give me what you have." She passed him the folder discreetly. "Don't tell anyone, please," she said, "and be careful." Marcus nodded and pushed off, returning to his desk. Emily forced herself to work, typing random data into spreadsheets. She was going through the motions, unable to concentrate. She remembered the phone call warning her not to dig deeper. She remembered the men who attacked Thomas. She thought about Thomas himself, now in a hospital ward, growing weaker. Just before lunchtime, Marcus approached again, a serious look on his face. He whispered, "These documents look real. Bank statements, old contracts, business deals that fell through. There are big names here, people from large firms and corporations. Emily, whatever this is, it's huge. Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Emily swallowed. "No, I don't," she said. "But I have no choice. I need to find a way to prove my father's claim before time runs out." She hesitated, then added, "He's in trouble, and I might be too." Marcus drummed his fingers on the divider. "If you need more help, let me know," he said. "But be careful, Em. This kind of thing could draw the wrong kind of attention." He returned to his work, leaving Emily feeling both grateful and uneasy. She glanced down at her phone and saw a missed call from the shelter's number. She bit the inside of her cheek, worried. The report was done, and the promotion would be decided soon, but her priorities had shifted. She needed to go to that hospital ward and check on Thomas. Yet she also needed more time to understand how to unlock the inheritance. Lunchtime arrived. Instead of heading out, Emily stayed at her desk. She skimmed through the documents again, focusing on the conditions for the inheritance. One clause mentioned that she must present certain original documents at a specific bank by the week's end. Without Marshall, she had no legal representation. She tried calling a few lawyers using online listings, but no one picked up right away. She left messages, growing more frustrated. Her phone vibrated again, another message from an unknown number. "Time's up soon. Decide which side you're on." She stared at the screen, her stomach dropping. They were watching her. They knew she was close to something important. By early afternoon, the staff meeting came and went. Mrs. Donovan said nothing about the promotion, only that it would be discussed the next morning. Emily nodded, pretending to care. She needed to hold on to her job for stability, but every minute felt like a delay she could not afford. She decided that as soon as work ended, she would go to the hospital and see Thomas. She would tell him what she found, ask him for more details. She had to confirm if the documents she had were all that she needed. As the clock reached 5, Emily packed her bag and left. Outside, the sky was darkening. She hailed a taxi and gave the address of the hospital ward the shelter had mentioned. The ride was silent. She looked out the window, scanning for anyone following. Nothing seemed out of place, but she remained tense. At the hospital wing, the hallways smelled like antiseptic. She found a nurse who directed her to Thomas's room. Inside, he lay on a thin mattress, eyes closed, breathing shallowly. Emily approached and gently touched his arm. His eyes opened slowly, focusing on her face. "Emily," he said, voice barely a whisper. "You found something, didn't you?" She nodded and pulled the chair closer. "I found documents. I tried to see Marshall, but he's missing. Your old partners, or whoever they are, they're threatening me. Time is running out." Thomas coughed, pain etched on his face. "The inheritance is real," he said. "You need to present the documents. Marshall can confirm their validity, but if he's gone, find someone else. Just don't waste time. They will try to stop you. That money, it's yours by right, and it will show the truth." Emily leaned in. "They mentioned ex-partners. I saw pictures of you with important businessmen. What happened?" Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. "They betrayed me," he said, voice strained. "Took everything, pushed me out. I thought staying away would protect you. But now you must stand up to them. You have the documents, right?" Emily nodded. "Yes, I have them. But I don't know if they're enough." Thomas exhaled slowly. "There's a contract that proves the fund is yours. It's with Jenny Cross. You must find her. She kept a key document safe. Without that, the bank may refuse to release the funds. She worked for me once. She knows what we're up against." Emily frowned, remembering the empty apartment. "Jenny's gone," she said. Her apartment was empty. Thomas's hand trembled slightly. "Then you must keep searching. Don't give up. Time is short." Emily swallowed, frustrated and worried. She watched his face, drawn and pale, and felt a surge of determination. She would not let these people win. She would find Jenny, or find another way to prove her claim. Before she left, Thomas gripped her wrist lightly, his gaze intense. "Be careful," he said. "They'll try again. Don't trust easily." Emily nodded, stood up and left the room, her head pounding with pressure. She would find a way, she had to. Emily left the hospital room feeling uneasy. Thomas was barely holding on, and Jenny Cross was still missing. Emily walked outside into the cool evening air, checking both ends of the street for anyone suspicious. Seeing no one, she headed home. She needed rest, but her mind did not slow down that night. She spent hours trying to call lawyers she found online, leaving voicemails, sending emails, and hoping someone would reply. No luck. By morning, she felt drained. She forced herself to go to work. At her desk, she typed aimlessly, eyes on the clock, mind elsewhere. Mrs. Donovan passed by without saying much. Marcus noticed her distant gaze and asked if she had any news, but Emily just shook her head. She needed to see Thomas again, to ask more questions, but the workday dragged on. During lunch break, Emily stepped out for a quick sandwich, then hid in a quiet spot near the staircase to check her phone. Still no lawyer responses, no new messages except junk mail. She tapped her foot, frustrated. She would have to meet Thomas again today and tell him she had gotten nowhere. She finished her lunch and returned to her desk, forcing herself to complete basic tasks. Hours crawled by, and finally she could leave. Outside, the city lights were starting to glow. She took a taxi to the hospital ward, hoping to find Thomas stable. She entered the building and approached the nurse's station. The nurse on duty gave her a confused look. Thomas, the nurse repeated. He's not here. 2 men came by earlier. They showed some papers, said they were transferring him for a special treatment. They took him out about an hour ago. Emily's heart dropped. What do you mean they took him? Where? She asked, voice sharp. The nurse shook her head. They didn't say. Their papers looked official. I assumed you knew. Emily clenched her fists. This was a kidnapping disguised as a transfer. She should have stayed closer, checked more often. She hurried down the hallway, searching for any staff member who might have details, but no one knew anything. She stepped outside, breathing heavily. Thomas was gone. Without him, she had only documents, no direct guidance. She looked around the dark street, her pulse pounding. They were always one step ahead of her. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She picked up, heart racing. A low voice spoke quietly. If you want to save him, you need to meet me now. Who is this? Emily demanded. Someone who can help, the voice said. Your father trusted me. Meet me at the old kiosk in Hudson Park, near the closed merry-go-round. Come alone. The call ended before she could respond. She stood there on the sidewalk, staring at her phone. She had no other leads. She remembered Thomas's words. Find Marshall. Trust him. Could this be Marshall? Hudson Park was not far. Emily walked quickly, hands in her coat pockets, eyes scanning the streets. She reached the park's entrance and passed through an old gate. Inside, the trees rustled with a slight breeze. Most lights were off, and only a dim lamp near an old restroom block provided some visibility. She moved toward the merry-go-round, now just a faded platform with chipped paint and no horses. Next to it stood a wooden kiosk with boarded-up windows. A figure stepped out from behind it. He looked thin, tired, hair disheveled, wearing a worn jacket and jeans. Emily, the man said softly. I'm Marshall. She took a step closer, trying to see his face. You're Marshall? She asked. I went to your office. It was destroyed. You disappeared. Marshall nodded, keeping his voice low. I've been in hiding. They want to stop me from helping you. Your father trusted me. I represented him, tried to protect his interests. Now that he's been taken, we have very little time. Emily swallowed. Thomas is gone. They took him from the hospital. I don't know where he is. Marshall nodded again. I know. Those men who attacked you and threatened Thomas are working for his former business partners. They want the inheritance blocked forever. If you fail to present the proper documents before the bank's deadline, the funds will be lost, and they can keep their stolen fortunes intact. Emily's throat tightened. I have documents, but I don't know if they're complete. Jenny Cross has something crucial, but I can't find her. Marshall looked around, nervous. Jenny knew your father's secrets. She guarded the original contract. Without it, the bank may refuse to recognize your claim. If we can't find Jenny, we must find another way. But first, we must secure what you have. Did you bring the documents? Emily shook her head. Not now. They're at my apartment. I was afraid to carry them around. Marshall sighed. Wise choice. Tomorrow morning you must scan and send them to a secure contact I know. This will freeze the account. Once it's frozen, only you can release it. That should buy us time to find Jenny, or figure out another approach. But we must move fast. Emily nodded, mind racing. What about Thomas? They'll hurt him, won't they? Marshall pursed his lips. They might use him as leverage. But if we secure the account and involve the authorities, we can force them to release him. The key is to prove your father's ownership and expose their corruption. They've hidden their crimes for decades, and they're desperate. Emily took a deep breath. How do I reach you again? Marshall pulled out a small card from his pocket and handed it to her. On it was a phone number. This is my burner phone, he said. Call me tomorrow after you send the documents. I'll guide you through the next steps. For now, go home, stay alert, and trust no one except me. Emily clenched her jaw. I understand. Is there anything else I should know? Marshall looked at her firmly. We may have to confront them directly. When we freeze the account, they might panic. That could give us a chance to find where they're keeping Thomas. Stay ready. Emily nodded, her legs feeling heavy. She looked around the dark park. No one else seemed to be there. The wind picked up slightly, rustling branches. She realized how quiet everything was, how dangerous this moment felt. She stepped back, putting distance between them. All right, she said. I'll do as you say. Marshall placed a hand on her shoulder briefly, then pulled away. Be careful, he said, and then slipped into the shadows, disappearing as quietly as he had appeared. Emily stood alone for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. She had a plan now, incomplete but better than nothing. Then she would secure the account, try to force the truth out into the open, and then use that leverage to rescue her father. Without Jenny, it would be harder, but she had to try. She turned and left the park, walking quickly toward the main street. Her phone and the card from Marshall felt like fragile lifelines in a dark, shifting world. At least now she had a next step, something concrete to do. Emily returned to her apartment, locked the door, and checked every room. Satisfied that no one was inside, she removed her coat and shoes, then headed straight for the kitchen table. She retrieved the folder containing all the documents. Her heart pounded as she laid them out, making sure everything was in order. She had to send digital copies to Marshall's contact first thing in the morning. This would freeze the account and buy her some time. She slept poorly, waking before dawn. After a quick shower, she made coffee and turned on her laptop. She placed the documents on a clean surface one by one, taking photos with her phone, then emailing them to herself. She downloaded and attached them to an encrypted email to the address Marshall had texted her late last night. She paused before hitting send. This was it. Once she did this, there was no turning back. She pressed send and watched the progress bar until it completed. She left her apartment, stepping into a chilly morning. The streets were quieter than usual. She took a longer route to the subway, changing trains twice, looking over her shoulder now and then. When she finally reached the office, she felt drained, but alert. Inside, the atmosphere was as ordinary as ever. Office chatter, the hum of computers, phones ringing. Marcus gave her a concerned look. "Emily, you sure you're all right?" he asked, leaning over the partition. "I did what I had to," she said quietly. "I might need your help again soon. Things are moving fast." He nodded, not asking questions. Emily turned to her computer and opened a blank document, pretending to work. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marshall's number. Received. Account frozen. Wait for instructions. Be ready. She exhaled, relieved that her part was done, at least for now. A few hours passed. Mrs. Donovan came by to inform her that the board was impressed with her report and wanted to talk promotions the next day. Emily smiled and thanked her, forcing a calm demeanor. Inside, she thought, I might not even be here by tomorrow if things go badly. At noon, Emily stepped out of the office and found a quiet corner in the lobby. She dialed Marshall's burner number. He answered on the second ring. Good, he said, keeping his voice low. The account is now locked up. They can't touch it without you. This will force them to act. Keep your phone on. We'll find out where they're holding Thomas. Emily gripped her phone tighter. What if they hurt him first? She asked. They need him alive, Marshall said. He's their only leverage. With the account frozen, they'll either try to bargain or come straight for you. Either way, we'll get their location. I have someone on the inside who might leak that info. Stay alert. Emily swallowed. I don't have much time. The inheritance deadline is close. It'll be fine, Marshall said. Focus on holding out. I'll contact you soon. He hung up, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. She re-entered the office, trying to appear normal. She made small talk with a co-worker, answered a few emails, and waited. By late afternoon, her phone buzzed again, this time a text from an unknown number. Come to the old warehouse near the waterfront at 8 tonight. Bring all documents. We have your father. Her chest tightened. She forwarded the message to Marshall's burner, then waited. He replied, Do not go alone. I'll meet you outside at 7:30. She relaxed slightly. She would not face them alone. But that meant risking a confrontation in a dangerous place. The workday ended slowly. As everyone packed up, Emily's mind ran through what might happen tonight. She told Marcus she had to leave early for a family emergency. He patted her shoulder, worried but supportive. She thanked him and left, her bag light now that she carried no original documents, only her phone and a small flashlight she had grabbed from home. She took a taxi to a corner a few blocks from the warehouse and waited. The streets were mostly empty, the air cold and still. At 7:25, she spotted Marshall approaching from the opposite sidewalk. He wore a dark jacket, hands in his pockets, head down. When he reached her, he nodded slightly. No turning back now, he said quietly. They're inside that old warehouse by the docks. I know the place, abandoned since the last shipment company closed down years ago. They'll expect you to come unarmed, but I have a contact standing by. If things get rough, we have backup. Emily's stomach churned. Are you sure we can trust your contact? Marshall nodded. Yes, he's been helping me behind the scenes. Let's go. They walked in silence toward the waterfront. The warehouse was a large corrugated metal building with broken windows and a dented sliding door. Dim light seeped from a few cracks. Emily's heart hammered as she approached. She saw a shadowy figure pacing inside. Marshall whispered, I'll circle around to the side. You go in through the front. I know it sounds risky, but I need to see how many of them are in there. They might show Thomas to you as proof. If they do, keep them talking. I'll move in when the time is right. Emily nodded, lips pressed together. She waited as Marshall slipped around the corner. She took a deep breath and stepped up to the partially open door. Inside, it smelled like rust and old oil. She saw two men by a stack of crates, one holding a metal pipe. Another stood to the left, arms crossed. And in the center, illuminated by a single hanging bulb, Thomas sat in a chair, wrists bound, looking pale and tired, but alive. Emily stepped inside, clearing her throat. I'm here, she said, raising her empty hands. Let him go. One of the men laughed softly. Where are the documents? I don't have them here, Emily said. They're safe. The account is frozen. I decide when to release it. You have no leverage unless you keep him alive. The man with the pipe stepped forward, glaring. You think you're in control? You have no idea how deep this goes. Emily's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. You can hurt me or threaten me, but it won't get you the money. The account can't be accessed without me. Let my father go, and maybe we can negotiate. Thomas lifted his head, meeting Emily's eyes. He looked weak, but managed a small nod of reassurance. Before anyone could respond, a sudden noise came from the side of the building. One of the men cursed and moved to investigate. Emily took a step forward, positioning herself between them and Thomas. The man who spoke first narrowed his eyes. You better call off whoever's out there, or your father pays for it. Emily clenched her fists, struggling to keep her voice even. No one's coming. It's just us. Let's talk. If you want this to end cleanly, release him now. A shadow shifted near the crates. Emily braced herself, hoping Marshall knew what he was doing. Any second now, something had to give. They were all on edge, the tension thick in the stale air. Emily's heart pounded. She could feel sweat forming on her palms. The men circled, tense and alert. Thomas remained bound to the chair, breathing hard. Emily tried to keep their attention on her words, buying time. One of the men stepped closer. He had a thin, sharp face and wore a gray suit jacket. This is your last chance, he said in a low voice. Give us the method to unlock the account, or your father suffers. Emily shook her head, trying to sound calm. You think I'm stupid? If I give you what you want, you'll have no reason to keep us alive. That account is the only leverage I have. Untie my father, and I'll consider cooperating. The man snorted. You're in no position to negotiate. Just then a metallic scrape sounded from the far side of the warehouse. The men spun around, startled. Emily held her breath. She didn't see Marshall, but she could sense his presence. One of the criminals cursed and moved toward the noise, gripping his pipe tightly. The other man turned back to Emily, stepping closer until they were only a few feet apart. He kept his voice low and threatening. If your friend is out there, tell him to show himself. We're done playing games. Emily took a step back, hands raised. Look, I can't control him. If you hurt my father, you get nothing. Let's just calm down and talk. This doesn't have to end badly. From behind a stack of crates, Marshall's voice rang out. The police are on their way, he said, tone steady. If you harm them, you'll only make it worse for yourselves. Drop your weapons. The man near Emily clenched his jaw. He glanced at Thomas, then at Emily. She saw doubt flicker in his eyes. He was weighing his options. If the police were coming, their time was limited. The one with the pipe reappeared, scowling. No cops outside yet, he said, but who knows how long we have. He looked at the man in the suit jacket. We should cut our losses. The suit jacket man shook his head. We need that account. We came too far to walk away. Emily took a deep breath, trying to project confidence. You won't get it. That account is locked down. Without me, it's useless. If you kill my father, I'll never cooperate. If you kill me, you'll never see a cent. The police will just seize the funds. A tense silence followed. Thomas coughed softly, wincing at the pain. Emily wished she could rush to him, but she didn't dare move yet. Marshall stepped into view, holding a piece of broken pipe in his hand. He stood tall, eyes on the criminals. Let them go, he said. This is your only chance to avoid a prison sentence. The men exchanged nervous glances. The one in the suit jacket reached behind his waist and pulled out a small knife, pointing it at Emily. Don't get any closer, he warned Marshall. Marshall shrugged. I'm not moving, but you're running out of time. In the distance, Emily heard faint sirens. Maybe Marshall had backup after all. The criminals tensed, looking at each other, searching for an escape route. The man with the pipe backed away, cursing under his breath. Emily moved to stand behind a wooden crate, still facing them. She kept her voice firm. Let's make a deal. Release my father and I'll walk out with you. We'll talk terms away from here. Otherwise, you'll be caught with hostages. The sirens grew louder. The knife-wielding man's eyes darted around. He grabbed the back of Thomas's chair and dragged it closer to the exit, keeping the knife pressed near Thomas's shoulder. Thomas gritted his teeth but said nothing. Marshall tightened his grip on the pipe. "Stop," he said. "You leave him behind. Take Emily if you must, but let Thomas go." Emily shot a quick look at Marshall. He was trying to give them a way out that minimized harm, but Emily knew she couldn't just leave Thomas. Still, she had to trust Marshall's plan. She nodded slowly. "If you let my father go right now, I'll follow you. I'll show you how to unlock the account later, but not here." The criminals hesitated. The one with the pipe was closest to the door, eyeing the flashing lights that now danced on the warehouse walls. Police cars were outside. They had no time left. "Fine," the knife wielder said, voice shaking slightly. He leaned down and cut the ropes around Thomas's wrists, then shoved the chair away. Thomas nearly fell but managed to stay upright. The man grabbed Emily's arm roughly. "You're coming with us," he said. Emily's heart raced. She had not expected it to actually happen. She glanced at Thomas, who was free but weak. He looked at her with worried eyes. Marshall tensed, but didn't rush forward yet. The pipe man opened the side door carefully, peeking out. He muttered, "Cops are searching the perimeter. We slip out through the docks." He signaled for the knife wielder to follow. Marshall cleared his throat. "You won't get far," he said calmly. "If you run with her, the cops will hunt you down. Leave her too. Save yourselves a kidnapping charge." The knife man tightened his grip on Emily's arm, pressing the blade lightly against her side. She sucked in a breath and tried not to panic. The sirens were close. Footsteps could be heard outside. The air smelled of dust and fear. Thomas tried to move forward but stumbled. Marshall shot him a glance as if telling him to stay back. The criminals were trapped. They knew it. The pipe man raised his hands slowly, backing away. "Let's go," he hissed to his partner. "We can't get stuck here." The knife man hesitated, sweat on his forehead. He looked at Emily, then at the door, then at the police lights. "Damn it," he muttered. He released Emily, pushing her away and stepping back. "Find your own way out." Emily stumbled forward, nearly falling into Marshall. The criminals bolted for a side exit at the far end of the warehouse, disappearing into the dark docks. Emily and Marshall rushed to Thomas's side, helping him stand. Police officers burst in seconds later, guns raised, shouting orders. Marshall and Emily raised their hands, stating they were victims, not culprits. The officers lowered their weapons after a tense moment and rushed to secure the area. Outside, more sirens wailed, and searchlights swept across the docks. Thomas leaned against Emily, breathing heavily. She supported him, relieved he was safe. Marshall stood nearby, silent but steady. They had survived the confrontation. The inheritance was still secure, and now they had evidence to present to the police and the bank. Within minutes, paramedics arrived to check Thomas's condition. Emily took a deep breath, shoulders sagging. She looked at Marshall. "Now what?" she asked softly. Marshall met her eyes. "We finalize everything. We show the authorities what we have, expose those criminals, and you claim what's yours." Emily nodded. The weight on her chest lifted slightly. They were not done yet, but this was a turning point. Emily leaned against the police car's hood, breathing in the cold night air. An officer was taking her statement, another was speaking with Marshall, and paramedics were checking Thomas's condition. The criminals had slipped away into the docks, but the police had a description of them and would keep looking. Emily handed over copies of some documents, explaining the basic outline of the conspiracy against her father. She kept to the facts. Thomas's former partners, the hidden inheritance, the recent attacks, and the forced disappearance of Thomas himself. Marshall stood nearby, arms crossed, listening quietly as Emily spoke. When the police finished their preliminary questions and let them go, he stepped closer to Emily and Thomas. Thomas sat on the back bumper of an ambulance, a blanket around his shoulders, looking tired but alert. "You did well," Marshall said to Emily. "You kept calm in there. You gave them just enough information so the police know where to start." Emily nodded, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "I'm just glad Thomas is safe," she said quietly. She turned to Thomas. "We have the documents. The account is frozen. They can't access it without me. Now we have a chance to expose them and claim what's rightfully yours." Thomas managed a small smile. "Ours," he corrected her gently. "That inheritance was set up for you, to protect you. It's not just about money. It's about proving what happened and clearing my name." A police detective approached, a notepad in hand. She spoke calmly. "We'll need both of you to come to the station tomorrow and give a formal statement. Bring any documents you have. We'll also contact the bank. With your cooperation, we can build a strong case." Emily agreed. "We'll be there," she said. The detective nodded and walked away. Emily sighed. "We need a lawyer to handle the inheritance formally. Marshall, can you help with that?" Marshall nodded. "Yes. I'm still a lawyer, even if I've been in hiding. With the danger reduced, I can come forward and represent you. The bank will recognize me if I present the proper credentials. Once we show them the original contracts and prove the wrongdoing, they will release the funds to you." Thomas cleared his throat. "What about Jenny Cross?" he asked. "She had a key document, the original contract. Did you find her?" Emily shook her head. "No, her apartment was empty. I couldn't find her anywhere. But I found other documents in that apartment, old letters and notes. It might be enough. If not, maybe the police can locate her now that we're involving them." Marshall adjusted his jacket. "Even without Jenny, we have enough evidence. The documents you secured and the frozen account create a strong position. The criminals will panic. Some of them may try to negotiate a deal with the police, possibly revealing where Jenny is. One way or another, we'll get what we need." Thomas nodded slowly, relief showing in his eyes. He looked at Emily. "I'm sorry I didn't come forward sooner," he said. "I tried to protect you by staying away, but I see now that leaving you in the dark only made things harder." Emily stepped closer and put a hand on his arm. "We're here now," she said. "It's going to be okay. We have a path forward." Paramedics finished checking Thomas's vitals and said he was stable, but should rest. Emily thanked them. With the immediate crisis over, the police taped off the warehouse, and the three of them left. Walking slowly down a quiet street toward a main road where they could catch a taxi, they found a late-night cafe still open. Inside, it was warm and smelled of coffee. They sat in a booth near the window. Emily ordered tea for Thomas and coffee for herself. Marshall just asked for water. For a moment, they sat in silence, each absorbing the events of the last few days. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "What happens next, specifically?" she asked Marshall. Marshall took a sip of his water. "Tomorrow we go to the police station, present more documents, and give full statements. I'll then arrange a meeting with the bank. With your presence and the evidence, the bank will recognize your right to the inheritance. That will unlock the funds, but it will also trigger a legal review, bringing the criminals' actions to light. The police will be able to track the funds and see who was involved." Thomas nodded. "The goal is not just the money," he said to Emily. "It's also about exposing the corruption. Those people ruined lives, not just mine. With this proof, we can finally hold them accountable." Emily sipped her coffee, feeling a mixture of relief and determination. "I never thought I'd find out my father was alive and in hiding on the streets," she said quietly. "I certainly never expected to be attacked over an inheritance I didn't know existed." Marshall's gaze softened. "Your father never planned for it to unfold this way. He tried to hide from danger, but fate brought you both into this mess. At least now we're in a position to fix it." Emily looked at Thomas, who sat quietly, drinking his tea. He seemed older and more fragile now that she saw him up close, away from the tension and fear. He had sacrificed his comfort and pride to keep her safe. She did not agree with his methods, but she understood his reasons. They finished their drinks and decided to head to Emily's apartment. She offered Thomas the chance to stay with her, at least until things settled down. Marshall agreed it would be safer for them to stick together until the bank and police cleared everything up. They paid the bill and stepped outside, where the night air was calm and still. A taxi ride later, they reached Emily's building. She led them inside, double-checking the locks. Thomas sat on the couch, exhausted. Emily pulled out a blanket, placing it over him. She lowered her voice. "Get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow is a big day." Thomas nodded. "Thank you," he whispered. Marshall stood near the window, looking at the quiet street below. "I'll leave you two alone for now," he said. "I have a few calls to make. I'll return in the morning." Emily followed him to the door. "Thank you, Marshall," she said softly. "I couldn't have done this without you." He nodded and slipped out. Emily locked the door. She turned back to Thomas, who was already half asleep, breathing steadily. She sat down at her small dining table, scrolling through her phone. The future felt uncertain, but more manageable now. They had the documents, the police involved, and a lawyer on their side. The criminals had lost their grip. As Emily turned off the lights, she thought of how much had changed in such a short time. She was no longer just a desperate employee racing to finish a report. She was someone who had uncovered secrets, stood up to threats, and reclaimed a piece of her family's past. Tomorrow, they would take the final steps to secure the inheritance and expose the guilty parties. For now, the apartment was quiet. Thomas rested peacefully. Emily felt her eyes grow heavy. She allowed herself to relax, knowing that when morning came, she would face it with a stronger heart. The hidden inheritance would come to light, justice would be served, and she and her father would finally begin to heal.